He began as Rome's steady hand and ended as the figure whispered about in the city's darkest alleys. The island of Capri, a place of sun and sea, became the locus of allegations so grotesque that they have haunted historians for 2 millennia. This episode examines those allegations, what ancient writers said, what might be true, and what the story of Tiberius on Capri tells us about power, rumor, and institutional rot. Content warning. This video discusses allegations of sexual violence, sexual exploitation of minors, and other forms of abuse reported by ancient sources. I will treat these claims with sobriety and restraint and will not describe sexual acts. Viewer discretion is advised. Tiberius Claudius Nero, later Tiberius Julius Caesar, arrived at the peak of Roman political complexity as a man already shaped by discipline and duty. He was not Augustus' first choice at every turn, but he proved himself a competent general and an able administrator. He restored order on Rome's frontiers, stabilized finances, and survived a perilous dynastic environment. Where Augustus cultivated an image of serene mastery, Tiberius offered a colder competence, reliable, efficient, sometimes austere. For many Romans, he carried the promise of continuity, a steady hand after the revolution that had birthed the Principate. But his path to absolute power was strewn with private tragedy and public pressure. Tiberius was married and divorced under orders, severed from Vipsania, the woman he truly loved, in order to take Julia, Augusta's daughter, as wife, a politically arranged match. Julia's very public scandals and eventual exile left social stains that would be used by critics to impugn anyone associated with her. The deaths of those closest to him, most crucially his son Drusus, amplified his withdrawal from public warmth. Grief, embittering loneliness, and a temperament already inclined to reserve nudged him towards seclusion that would become increasingly absolute. The crucial turning point came in 26 AD, when Tiberius left the mainland and established himself on Capri. The logistics were simple enough on paper: a string of sumptuous villas, cliffs descending to a blue sea, and an island defensible from immediate political interference. But the political effect was profound. From Capri, Tiberius ruled at a distance. Correspondence replaced audiences. Messages moved by sea and by mule. Orders were dispatched and honors granted by letter. The Praetorian Guard and the imperial administration at Rome handled day-to-day governance, while an inner circle of advisors, freedmen, and favorite servants formed the channel between the emperor and the empire. The move to Capri also shifted the atmosphere of the imperial court in fundamental ways. Seclusion tends to concentrate power in those nearest the ruler. Advisors like the astrologer Thrasyllus became more influential. The emperor's household, invisible to the formal checks of an open court, offered opportunities for flatterers and those willing to trade moral scruples for access. Rome's political life, already vulnerable to dilatores, professional accusers who profited from denunciations, became even more susceptible to decisions made by remote arbiters and to intrigues among those who administered imperial will. It is to this sequestered world that the most disturbing allegations attach. We must pause again, plainly. What follows describes allegations in the ancient sources concerning sexual exploitation, the involvement of children, and violent executions, claims that some modern scholars regard as rooted in factual occurrences, while others view them as slanders that grew in the telling. I will carefully attribute these claims to their authors and indicate where the evidence is contested. According to Suetonius and Tacitus, among other later writers, Capri became a place where imperial privilege met sexual corruption. Suetonius, writing in the early 2nd century in his Lives of the Caesars, is unsparing. His portrait of Tiberius is rich in scandal. He reports that young boys were brought to the island and trained as sexual servants, that some were referred to by the term spintriae, associated in later antiquity with tokens and perhaps brothel culture, that imperial entertainments involved displays and acts meant to gratify the emperor's appetites, and that for those whose usefulness had ended, cliffs became convenient graves. Tacitus, whose annals are shaped by a deep moral concern about power and its abuses, corroborates a climate of fear and cruelty, even if he is sometimes more circumspect about the lurid details. Cassius Dio and later historians take up the same themes, passing on a tradition in which the emperor's villa life was secrecy wrapped in decadence. These are powerful charges: sexual exploitation, including reports implying the involvement of minors, procurement and distribution of vulnerable people for the emperor's private use, and a regime of disposal, brutal, final, for those who displeased him. Yet the claims require careful handling. Suetonius wrote biographies intended to entertain as much as to instruct. His work mixes documented events with gossip, anecdote, and the rhetorical aim of character portraiture. Tacitus, for his part, is a moral historian, ever eager to show how tyranny corrupts. Both wrote with agendas and rhetorical tools that must be weighed. What then deserves being called probable? What might be rumor? And what can we never know? The safest conclusions are structural rather than forensic. We know beyond reasonable doubt that Tiberius withdrew to Capri, and that he exercised imperial power from there. We know that the court at Rome was transformed by distance. Access became filtered through intermediaries with their own incentives.
We know that treason trials multiplied in this period, that confiscations of property and executions increased, and that informers flourished. These are political facts, attested in multiple independent strands of evidence, and consistent with the broader narrative of Rome under an emperor increasingly suspicious of enemies. On the question of sexual exploitation and rituals specifically, the evidence is concentrated in literary testimony that is both vivid and problematic. Suetonius's account of boys at Capri and of sexual orgies is explicit in its accusation, but does not offer forensic detail. It aims to shock and to show moral decay. Tacitus frames excesses as symptomatic of an imperial character corrupted by isolation and suspicion. Cassius Dio repeats and amplifies. No surviving inscription or archaeological find from Capri spells out a program of institutionalized sexual rites. The material record, villas, cisterns, terraces, the village ovis, shows grandeur and seclusion, but not explicit proof of ritualized abuse. Some of the so-called physical indicators cited by earlier writers, pools, paraphernalia, are open to multiple interpretations. Coins and tokens called spintriae have been found, but their exact function is debated among pneumatists and historians. Were they brothel tokens, game counters, or something else? The link between such objects and imperial sexual practices on Capri is plausible but not conclusive. Consider the motif of the cliff. Suetonius claims that those who displeased the emperor were hurled into the sea from the island's heights. There is a compelling symbolic and logistical logic to this charge. Capri's cliffs offer a remote means to eliminate opponents with plausible deniability. Yet an isolated murder by cliff, a cruel anecdote, and a systemic, organized program of ritualized killing are different claims. Ancient writers favor the image of the cliff because it communicates the horror of secret executions. That image fits the narrative arc of a ruler who governs by fear and erases enemies. But while individual deaths and executions likely occurred, the scale and ritualization described in some passages should be treated as charged narrative elements rather than solely archaeological facts. Another recurring detail is the so-called spintria. The term appears in literary sources and is linked in later tradition to brothels and tokens used in sex work. Some ancient coins or tokens depicting sexual positions were labeled by later scholars as spintriae. Other scholars caution that their meaning was more varied. It is tempting to draw a straight line from spintriae to the presence of organized sexual servitude for the emperor. Tempting, but not conclusive. Historians must acknowledge that the sources use language that moralizes and sexualizes, and that Roman attitudes towards sexual scandal are entangled with political motives.
Accusing an unpopular ruler of sexual depravity was a common rhetorical strategy in antiquity, useful to both contemporary enemies and later moralizing biographers. We must also consider motive. Why would Suetonius, Tacitus, and Dio emphasize sexual transgression in their portraits of Tiberius? Part of the answer lies in genre and expectation. Roman historiography often moralized the private life of public men. Sexual vice signified moral vice. Moral vice explained political catastrophe. By connecting private depravity to public harm, authors made a persuasive causal story for readers worried about tyranny. For Tacitus, who mourned the erosion of senatorial authority and republican virtue, Tiberius embodied the personification of moral and political failure. For Suetonius, whose biographies trade on titillation and scandal, the Lord stole the spotlight because it sells the life story and satisfies an appetite for moral drama. At the same time, we should not dismiss the possibility that many victims existed, or that some of the most horrific allegations had a kernel of truth. The structure of the imperial household and the social economy around it created opportunities for procurement and exploitation. The existence of delatores and a legal architecture for maestas, treason, meant that denunciations could be weaponized. Sexual vulnerability could be commodified by those seeking favor or by agents acting directly on imperial command. A regime in which secrecy was prized and accountability diminished is a regime in which abuses can multiply unseen. In that sense, whether every charged anecdote is true or not, the social conditions for sexual exploitation and brutal punishments were certainly present. The machinery of terror extended far beyond Capri. Back in Rome, the judiciary increasingly became an instrument for confiscating wealth from the accused. Informers, sometimes acting from genuine zeal, but often motivated by personal enrichment, brought charges that could lead to the death of an opponent and the absorption of his estate into imperial coffers. Wealth confiscation provided both a financial incentive and a political tool. The line between justice and plunder became blurry. This economy of fear was amplified when the Praetorian prefect Sejanus rose to unprecedented prominence. Sejanus is essential for understanding the political dynamic of the late Tiberian period. Initially the commander of the Praetorian Guard, he consolidated his power through shrewd alliances and administrative acumen. He exploited the emperor's absenteeism, cultivating the emperor's trust while extracting influence at Rome. Sejanus centralized authority, restructured the guard, and became the man through whom petitions and impeachments flowed. For a while, he seemed to be the axis of power in Rome, the de facto steward of the emperor's will, but his ascendancy made him many enemies.
Tacitus portrays Sejanus as ambitious and ruthless, willing to use the legal system against rivals. The turn came in 31 AD, when, after a brief but decisive move by forces loyal to Tiberius and informed by a network of denunciations and letters, Sejanus fell from power and was executed. His fall was sudden and brutal, a dramatic reversal which itself speaks to the precariousness of top-down rule conducted through intermediaries. Sejanus's rise and fall illustrate how the imperial center could be perverted into a predator, and how the intermediaries closest to power could become tyrants in miniature. The pattern is instructive. Seclusion breeds dependence. Dependence empowers mediators. Mediators, unaccountable and ambitious, reshape institutions to their advantage. The result is not just the moral corruption of a single ruler, but the transformation of the state into a network of predatory relationships. As Tiberius aged, the mixture of personal withdrawal, political paranoia, and physical decline deepened. Ancient sources depict an emperor increasingly detached, prone to suspicion, and given to cruel measures. Non-sexual grotesqueries are reported, descriptions of infirmity, of the emperor's bodily deterioration, his aversion to public appearances, and his dependence on the palace machinery. These physical details in the sources function narratively. They provide a visible index of moral decay. When the emperor's body is described as failing, the state too becomes imagined as failing. Tiberius's death in 37 AD is narrated with ambiguity and suspicion. Some ancient accounts suggest he died of natural causes, others hint at foul play. Suetonius and others report versions in which the new claimant to power, Gaius, Caligula, or his allies may have hastened the end. One persistent circulation of rumor claims that Tiberius was smothered, an image with dramatic force, but we must treat such stories as plausible rumor rather than proven fact. The structure of rumor itself is instructive. When a ruler has been feared and reviled, rumors of a violent end serve as narrative catharsis for contemporaries and later historians. What is less disputable is the public reaction, a mix of relief, opportunity, and fear, and an immediate restructuring of power as Caligula briefly seized the reins. After the emperor's death, Rome's memory of the Capri period became part historical account, part moral fable. Later authors reused its imagery to warn about the corrupting effects of absolute rule. But historians centuries later have disagreed about the proportion of fact to slander. Some modern scholars, including proponents of a more revisionist approach, argue that sexually tinged accusations were exaggerated, the product of hostile senatorial sources and sensationalizing biographers.
They emphasize the administrative competence Tiberius displayed at other moments, and point out that slander against emperors, especially in the sensational register of sexual depravity, was a familiar rhetorical tool in Roman historiography. Other contemporary historians take a different tack. They argue that the institutional incentives,
The testimony of multiple independent ancient authors and the contextual signs of systemic abuse make it irresponsible to dismiss the accounts outright. For them, the charge is that the structure of the source's bias may color occasional details, but the consistency of themes across authors, seclusion, sexual scandal, executions, treason trials, and confiscations, suggests an underlying truth about how the imperial household operated and victimized people. Neither monocausal dismissal nor wholesale acceptance is satisfactory. A balanced historiography insists on three things: attributing claims to their sources, assessing the motives and genres of those sources, and reading the political structure of the time to see how abuse could have occurred. In practice, that means acknowledging that Suetonius's catalog of vices is colored by taste for scandal, that Tacitus's moralizing frame predisposes him to interpret events as symptomatic of imperial decay, and that Cassius Dio, writing later, works within a historiographical tradition that delights in the salacious. Simultaneously, it means not discarding everything these writers say simply because they wrote to persuade as much as to inform. Archaeology offers limited assistance. On Capri, excavations of the village Ovis and other sites reveal the architecture of seclusion: terraces, cisterns, stairways descending to the sea, ceremonial rooms, and private spaces. These features make possible the kinds of privacy reported in texts, but architecture alone cannot identify the uses to which rooms and spaces were put. Objects such as brothel tokens or coins with erotic imagery are ambiguous in function and interpretation. The absence of inscriptions detailing abuses is not exculpatory. Silence is no proof of innocence, but nor is isolated material culture definitive proof of systemic sexual rituals. What archaeology can do is corroborate the basic facts of seclusion and imperial luxury. It cannot by itself adjudicate the most sensational charges. Beyond the forensic problem, there is an ethical one. How do we tell this story without exploiting victims, without indulging lurid curiosity, and without turning abuse into spectacle? The guides are caution and context. First, language matters. Use clinical terms: sexual exploitation, sexual abuse, forced sexual acts, child victims, and avoid descriptive detail that reenacts harm. Second, prioritize the structural analysis. Show how institutions, economic incentives, and social norms created possibilities for abuse and made redress difficult.
Third, center the humanity of victims without re-traumatizing. Indicate that human lives were damaged or destroyed, that families and communities were affected, and that political calculations often erased personhood. Where modern scholarship has been most useful is in parsing motive and probability. Some historians have argued that the imperial court's closeness to sexual scandal is a rhetorical trope used across multiple reigns. Others have insisted that the specific conditions of Tiberius's rule, a capable but reclusive ruler, a powerful praetorian prefect, and an institutionalized informer system make the Capri allegations especially plausible. Recent scholarship tends to resist binary judgments, instead mapping degrees of probability. For instance, the likelihood that sexual exploitation occurred in some form is high because exploitation was a feature of many ancient polities and because the mechanisms for procuring live human commodities existed in Roman social and economic life. The likelihood that every anecdote reported by Suetonius is literally accurate is much lower. The balance sits, therefore, in recognizing the probable existence of abuse without trusting the precise narrative form in which the abuse was later retold. We should also consider why the Capri narrative stuck. Images of pools that mask cries, villas where pleasure and terror intertwined, and cliffs that hid bodies are memorable and morally instructive. They become emblematic in later cultural depictions because they express an anxiously held belief that private vice in the imperial palace can translate directly into public harm. In the Roman imagination and for later generations, Capri came to stand for hidden depravity at the heart of power. That symbolic weight is itself a kind of historical truth. Whether every detail is verifiable, the psychological and political aftermath is plain. The stories shaped responses to subsequent emperors, influenced legal reforms, and entered the stock of cautionary tales about the dangers of absolute rule. There remains the uncomfortable question of complicity. The imperial system did not operate in a vacuum. Senators, equestrians, freedmen, procurers, and even ordinary citizens were enmeshed in the economy of favor and fear. Many benefited materially from the status quo. Others feared denunciation and therefore avoided intervention. Those who had moral qualms found themselves with limited means to redress the situation without risking their own safety. This social complicity does not absolve any one actor, but explains how abusive systems persist. When survival and advancement depend on silence or collusion, institutions mutate to sustain abuse.
If we step back from the sensational detail to a more structural conclusion, the story of Tiberius on Capri becomes less a lurid chronicle and more a case study in how absolute power, secrecy, and incentivized lawlessness interact.
An emperor's physical distance from the seat of politics, while practically manageable, reduces transparency. The concentration of decision-making in a small, unaccountable circle, plus the monetization of accusation through property confiscations, creates a fertile field for exploitation, sexual, political, and economic. In that formulation, Capri is less an exotic stage for peculiar rituals than a crucible where existing tendencies in Roman governance intensified. Before we close, a brief note on how a responsible visual production might represent these themes. Producers should avoid reenacting sexual acts or depicting minors. Substitute imagery communicates the same moral horror without replicating abuse. Long shots of cliffs at dusk, vacant sandals on a marble floor, an abandoned child's cloak caught on a balustrade, brothel tokens laid on a table, manuscripts and palimpsests with marginalia, close-ups of weathered statuary, maps showing the distance between Capri and Rome, and the silent corridors of Villa Jovis. When dramatizations are used, they should be explicitly labeled as reconstruction or speculation. On-screen citations should identify Suetonius, Tacitus, and Cassius Dio as primary literary sources, and modern scholars when their interpretations are referenced. Music and sound design should be somber and restrained, avoiding sensational cues that sexualize or titillate. We end where we began, with the title's provocative claim, The Disturbing Sexual Rituals of Emperor Tiberius on Capri, and with a sober account of what that claim can responsibly mean. The phrase captures a tradition. Ancient authors reported that sexual exploitation, including the involvement of minors and violent disposal, occurred on Capri. They associated these acts with the emperor's isolation and with a broader pattern of repression. Modern historians must balance the weight of those reports against the author's motives and the limits of the archaeological record. The most honest answer is mixed. Some form of sexual exploitation and brutality was likely, facilitated by the seclusion of imperial power and the incentive structures of the regime. The precise ritual forms and the more lurid details are difficult to verify, and in many cases likely amplified by hostile or moralizing narratives. The broader lesson is institutional. Absolute power corrupts not only the holder, but also the institutions that surround them. Secrecy and distance transform governance into a network of intermediaries who may act with impunity. When law becomes a tool of enrichment and repression, victims are produced and silenced. Memory and rumor will fill the gaps, sometimes with plausible reconstruction, sometimes with narrative decoration.
Our task as readers and viewers is to hold both the horror and the uncertainty. Acknowledge harm where it is probable, insist on evidence where it is necessary, and understand that institutions, not just individuals, must be accountable if such harms are to be prevented. If this examination has raised questions for you about which ancient account you find most persuasive or which modern interpretation adds nuance, please leave a thoughtful comment. For those who follow deep historical investigations, consider subscribing to stay on these difficult but necessary stories. Read Suetonius' Tiberius and Tacitus' Annals with a critical eye, and consult modern works that grapple with these texts and their biases. The story of Capri is both about an emperor's supposed excesses and about how societies remember and recompose episodes of atrocity. It remains a warning that power unchecked has the capacity not only to corrupt policy, but to normalize cruelty. Speculative note for reconstruction. If one were to imagine a brief scene to capture the moral atmosphere, a closed peristyle at dusk, the silhouette of an emperor leaning over a ledge while the sea mutters below, the hush of servants moving like ghosts, such a scene should be introduced explicitly as a creative reconstruction, not as factual reenactment. It is a poetic attempt to visualize the structural dynamics historians discuss, not evidence of specific acts. In the end, the disturbing reports from Capri persist in our imagination because they encapsulate an enduring fear that private vice at the center can erode public life at the periphery until a whole polity is deformed. Whether every dreadful detail is true matters to historians, but the wider moral remains urgent. Power sheltered from accountability can become monstrous. History's duty is to witness, to interrogate sources, and remember the victims whose voices were suppressed. If you have sources or books you recommend on this subject, share them below, and consider watching our related episode on the politics of imperial secrecy in Rome to deepen the inquiry.